Okay.
She's in. She's in now, so thank you for that.
Excellent. I have Councillor Braden, Bach, Flynn, Bobby George, Campbell, Mejia. Anyone else? Kim Janey's just joined us. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. City Councilor Lydia Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Operations. It is Tuesday, December 1st, 2020, and we are here today for a virtual working session on Docket 0885, Ordinance establishing a civilian review board within the City of Boston, and Docket 1094, Ordinance establishing the Office of the Police Accountability and Transparency. Docket 0885 was sponsored by Councilors Andrea Campbell, Ricardo Arroyo, and Julia Mejia, and was referred to the committee on July 29, 2020. The committee held a public hearing on that docket on September 8th. Docket 1094 is sponsored by the mayor and was referred to the committee on November 18th, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's executive order modifying certain requirements of the Open Meetings Law, we are conducting this working session virtually via Zoom. This enables the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public health accommodations. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, and FiOS 964. As a quick review, Docket 0885 would establish a civilian review board in the City of Boston, which would review, investigate complaints of police misconduct and internal affairs investigations, and recommend disciplinary actions and changes to the Boston Police Department's policies, procedures, and practices. The ordinance lays out board structure and member appointment, the establishment of a budgeted office for support staff, required trainings, powers and duties, processes and procedures for review of complaints, investigations, and public access and reporting requirements. At the hearing on September 8th, the committee heard from the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, heard from the past president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, and also heard from a former member of the Boston Co-op, Larry Mays, also state representatives Russell Holmes, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, ACLU, Massachusetts, and also the president of MAMLEO, Eddie Crispin, David Hernandez of the Latino Law Enforcement Group as well, Diego, and BPS student Darwin Saravia. The panel discussed best practices and confirmed that the proposal includes the majority. Recommendations for an effective CRB included independence from the Boston Police Department, independence in accessibility from the Boston Police Department, and subpoena power, ability to discipline or make strong recommendations, language access, shared appointment power, and constant and consistent data collection. There were some also suggestions that included increasing the number of monthly public meetings, adding specific language about data collection and analyzation for racial disparities with the goal of reducing disparities, developing a common community nominating process, and possibly including a youth member on the board, or at least including mechanisms for better interactions between the youth and the police. Concerns raised included impartiality of the CRB appointments, how much funding the CRB will require, and where the budget will come from. Duplication of efforts is also discussed with regards to the co-op and nonprofit groups, and the statute of limitations, especially for youth, and in light of automatic footage deletage. Docket 1094, introduced by the mayor, would establish an Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, which would support the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel and Civilian Review Board. The two versions of the, I guess I would call it the IOP, Internal Affairs Oversight Panel, and the Civilian Review Board referred to in the mayor's docket are not in reference to Councilor Campbell's originally filed CRB, but instead were created by executive orders on November 12th. In review, and the OPAT would support those two offices and review the investigation of complaints of police misconduct and internal affairs investigations, as well as police department policies, procedures, and practices. As a point of clarification, again, just to make clear, while the November 12th executive orders are relevant to considerations of Docket 1094, the executive orders themselves are not before this body. What we are discussing are the two ordinances, which is 1094 and 0885. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to introduce my colleagues. I'm going to then explain the procedure for which this working session will go through, and I'll also explain why we're doing it this way. So again, just for public's purposes, I have who are, as my colleagues attending this, Councillor Braden, Councillor Bach, Councillor Flynn, Councillor Sabi George, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Mejia, and Councillor Janey. Are there any city councillors that joined in my, Councillor Arroyo is also here. And I think that's all that I can see right now. So that being said, I want to be clear about what we're doing and why we're doing it in this way. Normally an ordinance is introduced, it comes to this committee, and I have a hearing about that. That's the procedure I took with the original, the Civilian Review Board ordinance introduced by Councillor Campbell, Councillor Arroyo, and Councillor Mejia. The mayor's recent ordinance came in November, and as a result, I wanted to, I had hoped that we could get to some sort of resolution conclusion together by the end of this year. We only meet as a body and can only vote until I want to say the last time we meet is the 16th of December. As a result, instead of having a separate hearing on the OPAT, I thought it made more sense to just go ahead and say this is under consideration, and we're going to see if we can get to work in a working session, which is what we're doing today. My goal, and I hope we all can stand there, is that we can collaboratively get to the end goals of police accountability, transparency, a more just system, one that people increase their trust in our policing and feel that the city of Boston is rising to the occasion of this particular moment of racial tension, of questioning our systems, and also that people of color specifically feel that the city of Boston, the city council, is rising to the occasion and hearing their concerns. So that is the goal of this working session. The goal is not to go back and forth over who did what first. And I'm going to run a tight ship in making sure we have the conversation that I think we need to have. I'm actually encouraged by the fact that people are eager to do something, as I know many of the advocates who are going to testify today have been wanting something to get done for decades. And I want to thank them for their advocacy. So how this will go, we will have the administration, because there was not a formal hearing about the OPAT ordinance, they will do a brief 15 to 20 minutes maximum presentation on what that ordinance that they have introduced would do. They can call upon other folks within that task force, whomever, to speak within that time, but then we are going to, after you outline that, there will be a Q&A from counselors asking to make sure that there was clear and asking to make sure that we are all understanding what is going on. We will then have Councillor Campbell will lead the overview/review of the ordinance she proposed, because that was part of this working session anyway. And there could be a back and forth about how those two marry, how they can come together, what we can do together, and what we're not willing to do. I want everyone to be completely transparent, though. I don't really have the time to dance around or be peppered with a bunch of questions if ultimately the answer is no. And that's for both sides, all perspectives. The goal is to get to something. It's to get to yes. I will allow for some very brief opening remarks. And by that, I mean, get to the point, have a point, explain why you're speaking. And I'm saying this to my colleagues because we have a lot of work to do and very little time. I'm going to particularly be focused on the lead sponsors to be as brief, poignant, and to the point and then we're going right to the administration. So for the lead sponsors, you have first the floor to be as brief as possible. Then I will ask my colleagues if you have anything to add or say something different. So that being said, Councillor Campbell, if you'd have any brief remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And of course, thank you to my co-sponsors, Councillors Arroyo and Mejia, for your partnership. We have said for a long time that the structures we build to review and investigate complaints of police misconduct are a critical part, of course, of the broader police reform movement, and they will determine how we hold our individual police officers in the department as a whole accountable. And I am beyond grateful that at this point, there seems to be real consensus among the council and my colleagues, and of course, along with the mayor, that we need to establish a civilian review board. And of course, I'm also saddened and disappointed that it took the public and painful murder of George Floyd by police to get us to this point. For years, activists have pushed this to happen. I, along with other councilors, including my predecessor, Councilor Yancey, have pushed the administration to work with us to strengthen civilian oversight of our police department. I filed 3 hearing orders on this issue over the last few years, opportunities for us to have public, community-informed conversations about why this is so important, all three of which were ignored by the administration. My priority has always been to pass the strongest possible legislation to create a civilian review board. And to do this requires the council and the mayor to work in partnership on establishing an ordinance that would establish a board, its authority, its responsibilities, and appointment structure. We have one ordinance that actually does that, which my co-sponsors and I, of course, filed back in July. And we asked the administration to weigh in directly on that, to even send us constructive feedback or suggestions. And we never received that. Instead, they chose to author their own and to file that via executive order. I want to say I'm extremely grateful and remain grateful to members of the task force who stepped up to do the hard work and have for a really long time, and especially for making the Civilian Review Board a top priority in the recommendations. But I will say the mayor's approach to doing this by executive order is disappointing because I think it falls short of having a lasting independent civilian oversight. An executive order is not permanent. If we are committed to this being a lasting, impactful reform, then we need it to be an ordinance, and we must pass an ordinance that codifies the Civilian Review Board. So I think it's enforceable and of course will last beyond the current administration. I also believe the council's language in the ordinance is stronger in that it provides a structure that I think is most accountable and most accessible to the public. National best practices for civilian oversight boards call for community members to have a seat on boards reviewing all cases, both citizen complaints and internal affairs investigations, alongside legal experts, which is what our ordinance proposes. Whereas the administration proposes 2 separate oversight boards with different authorities and different members, excluding the average resident from the internal affairs oversight panel, and I think creating unnecessary additional bureaucracy. I absolutely do think these are all things that we can actually reconcile. Mm-hmm. We can reconcile the differences between the executive orders and the ordinances, and of course, create the most effective structure for police accountability and transparency, and do so in partnership. So thank you, Madam Chair. Again, thank you to my co-sponsors, Councilor Mejia and Councilor Arroyo as well.
Thank you. I'm just taking executive, doing my own executive order. The only other opening remarks will be from the co-sponsors, and we're going to go right to work. Sorry, feeling pressure for the time. Councilor Mejia and then Councilor Arroyo, then we're going right to the administration.
All righty then, let the games begin. Thank you to the chair and to my colleagues for sponsoring one of the 2 dockets that we're here to discuss today. We have been at this conversation for over 100 years. A civilian review board is an incredible low bar for the city to enact, but it is a bar. Let me turn this thing off here. But it is a bar that we seem to keep tripping over time and time again. But here we are with only a little over 2 weeks left in the legislative year. We have not 1, but 2 civilian review boards on the agenda to discuss. This is an issue of voice and power, and who has it and who does not. In our plan, we put the power into the hands of the people because it's not, because if we're not at the table, you know what happens, we're always ending up on the menu. We have been getting in, and we've been getting eaten up alive here. We fought for youth voice to sit on this board. We fought for lived realities to inform the expertise, and we are fighting for the board's recommendation to be taken seriously. We can't let this one token form of justice where we let the people think, quote unquote, they have the power. In our ordinance, the people have the power, and that's what we need to be fighting for. And I will say this, just really quick, is that Councillor Edwards, I'm all in on the whole idea. This is not an opportunity for us to see who's bigger and badder and better. I'm not here for those politics. I'm here to get to a place where we're going to decide how do we build a consensus to get where we need to be, right? So I'm invested in making sure that we have youth representation on this board, and that's what I'm gonna fight for. I've been very clear about that piece of the ordinance in terms of what I see is important. And I need to, for my own little sake here, because if I can't understand something, I know that the people that I serve clearly won't be able to understand it either. And so we need to make sure that whatever it is that we're going to adopt, it needs to be digestible and easy to understand and live by. So I'm here for wherever we land, but we got to land somewhere, and it can't be who's better. It's about what is the best for the people, period. End of story. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll keep it brief so that we can get right to the work. I think what the ordinance contains and the differences has sort of been explained, and I don't really feel I have to wade into that. What I will say is, I think what makes this bridgeable is what the two ordinances seek to do in terms of the powers they seek to give these boards, in terms of how these boards are construed, is largely similar. And the people who have power on these boards and the powers that they would have in both ordinances is largely similar. And so what the questions that I remain with and that I'm hoping we can iron out and get to a point on is the bureaucratic aspects of two boards as opposed to one, having one administrative focus on two different groups with the funding situation. Because I know one of my major concerns, and I'll just put it on the table, is we can create a look. We can have a board with powers that we seek to empower with, but if we don't fund it, then it's not going to do any of the work that we're seeking for it to do. And so what I'm looking for when we do this is something that is stable, structured, and the problem with executive orders is they expire with the mayor. And so things that are permanent, things that give power to our communities in real ways, and a way in which we can really make sure that there's no bureaucratic issues within that body that keep it from reaching and doing things that we want it to do. And so I believe we can bridge that. I think we certainly can do it before the end of this year. And so I look forward to hearing from folks, in some cases in this setting for the first time, not in the work that they've done. Some folks here have been working on this for decades. And so I appreciate that work. I appreciate the folks who've been on the task force because I think we all share the same goal of putting something strong together with real power. And so I think that's why we can make this work. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it now over to the administration. For my colleagues, you would have received an email from Michelle with comparison of the documents. I believe it includes the executive orders themselves. So you would have both ordinances, both executive orders, minutes from the prior hearing on 0885, the administration's comparison chart, Councillor Campbell's comparison chart as well. So I want to be clear that that's all before us. We get to work in the working sessions I host, so you got your tools. So we're going to turn it now over to the administration. Really hoping we can get that to like the 15-minute kind of summary. We really appreciate you being here. I want to be clear to everybody, when I spoke with the administration just yesterday, there was a full-on commitment to get to work in that conversation. So I just wanted that to be very clear. Everyone is here to work, everyone, and I'm proud of that. So thank you, I'll turn it over to Jerome and you introduce and do what you're gonna do.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you to all the counselors for having us here today. I'm joined today by Tanisha Sullivan, who is the president of the NAACP Boston branch, Allison Cartwright, who is the attorney at charge for the Roxbury Defender's Office, and Jamal Crawford, who has been a community activist working on police issues for many, many, many years here in the city of Boston. We wanted to come here today to talk about the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, and we're going to leave our comments to that. And discussions about the counselor's CRB, I guess we'll leave for the working session where we can make comparisons to the current existing civilian review board that the mayor created 2 weeks ago. So for the purpose of the OPAT, is what we refer to as the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, is a single point of entry. So we want the public to understand that while others continue to say that there are multiple points of entry and it's confusing, it's not technically confusing, Madam Chair. It's a single point of entry of one department, which would be the Office of Public Accountability and Transparency of Commission. Residents would go to that one place, one portal of entry. They will get a caseworker, work with individuals, and then based on what the topic of their case is and what they're actually asking the Office of OPAT to do, there's two different boards. One that is just purely the oversight of the internal affairs for pre-existing cases. They can now look at all cases. Since the mayor signed that executive order, and then a civilian review board, which is much more robust, allowing us to look at a whole host of other different opportunities and ideas. And so for us, the importance is to having this independent commission that has an executive director, that has the investigators, that has the legal staff, the statisticians. That is what we're looking for, to have that one-stop shop. And we're looking, and the framework is important because that allows the two other boards of residents to purely look at the cases that are bringing before them, look into other issues, charge the staff. You can think of the OPAT office as kind of the administrative arm of this whole three-legged stool. And so we here today, we think that while we have discussions about the boards and how the boards are going to interact, the real importance for the administration, for us to administrate this justice, is to have a sole office and commission that has this ability, the powers and the authority, and also investment through the city budget of the resources that they need. And so we're looking forward to having this conversation. I know there's a lot of comparisons between the OPAT and the Civilian Review Board, but I want to turn it over and allow the task force members in this limited amount of time we have administration. So I'm going to yield the rest of my time to Tanisha Sullivan, the president of the Boston branch of the NAACP, for her to talk to you about why the task force chose the three-legged stool approach for this important work.
Thank you, Jerome. I do want to, and of course, thank you to the council for providing us with this time. I want to just make sure that we are clear for the record about this task force, which was established by the mayor in July following the racial reckoning that we've seen across this country, but that surely hit the city of Boston. The task force was chaired by former U.S. Attorney Wayne Budd, and was comprised of members from across the city of Boston, representing really a diversity of perspective, a diversity of ideology on this issue, but also was comprised of all Black and Brown residents from across this city, really speaking to the heart of this issue. As a body, we broke into about 4 subcommittees, if you will, within the task force. The subcommittee that took responsibility for reviewing what was formerly known as the co-op, and as of November 12th is known as the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel, was comprised of 4 individuals. As Jerome mentioned, I served on that subcommittee representing the NAACP Boston branch. I was joined by Joseph Feaster, who is the chair of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, and also Allison Cartwright, the attorney in charge for Roxbury Defenders through CPCS. Of course, as we know, the body that represents, that provides legal support and counsel and representation to those in our community who cannot afford it, and Jamal Crawford, who, as Jerome mentioned, is a longstanding community advocate and activist in this space, but I would argue certainly one of the thought leaders when it comes to issues of policing reform, widely recognized as such, and someone who has been in this space really leading and trying to push all of us to do more and to do better. With that, I will say, as we began our review of the co-op, formerly known as the co-op, now Internal Affairs Oversight Panel, we brought to bear certainly all of our collective experiences as individuals, but also I brought to bear the experience and expertise in the historical perspective of the NAACP. And of course, Joseph Feaster brought that of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, coupled with, of course, the experiences that Attorney Cartwright was able to bring to bear for those who are directly impacted by this very important work. All of that to say, we quickly realized that what currently existed as the co-op was not adequate and was failing in so many respects, as had been well documented for years. And quite frankly, several of us through our organizations as well as individuals have actively advocated with this body. Some of you were not there, but some of you have been there as we have actively advocated with this body to take action as it relates to policing reform and policing accountability. Unfortunately, as has been noted, many of those requests for action by the City Council here in the City of Boston, as well as our requests and our advocacy around action by the administration has fallen on deaf ears. I want to be clear about that. And so as we entered our deliberations, it was critically important to us that we built upon the research and the advocacy that has been done across the city in this space for well over a decade, but that we also were very intentional about reaching out to and speaking with and studying the structures that exist in other cities across this country. And so we certainly spoke with the leaders in New York City, with respect to their civilian oversight process, as well as in Chicago. We also were closer to home here in Cambridge, and also, of course, research what the national best practices are in this space. Most importantly, we went directly to the people and held multiple hearings with community, listening sessions, I should say, with community to hear what their concerns are and what their hopes were for addressing policing accountability and transparency. And then, of course, once we developed the structure that we thought was responsive to everything that we had heard, we went back to community. And again, made sure that we were at every step of this process in lockstep with the people. And so I really do appreciate Councilor Mejia's comments about the importance of the people being centered to this work. Always. That said, we ultimately landed on a structure that does provide for more supports for this work, independence for this work, teeth in this work. The Office of Policing Accountability and Transparency serves really as the house for both internal affairs review and also for civilian review. The internal affairs review, of course, we recommended and we were pleased it was accepted for expanded scope and authority of that body, and also for that body to have access to investigators to help support their work, coupled with the subpoena power that would be held within the Office of Policing Accountability and Transparency. We felt very strongly that those individuals who serve on that body have a background, knowledge and understanding of how police systems work, how law enforcement works. And so within our recommendations, we did advise that members of that panel have a specific level of expertise and experience, similar to what is currently or what was the case with the co-op. With respect to the civilian review and having a very narrow scope, of course. With respect to the Civilian Review Board, of course, best practices show that representation from civilians, from residents from across the city is critically important, that they be empowered, that their voice be heard, and that they have a level of autonomy that allows for true accountability. And so with that, the scope of and the reach of the Civilian Review Board is much more expansive than we had initially contemplated. But we felt, again, that was critically important. Again, being responsive to not only the best practices that we've seen across the country, but also being responsive to what we specifically heard from the residents of the city of Boston through the multiple community listening sessions that we were able to host. The Civilian Review Board composition is one that was heavily debated. We did feel strongly that there should be a voice for the city council, and that the city council should have the opportunity to participate in the appointment process. We also, it certainly explored, whether there should be additional criteria or expertise required for civilians to serve on this board. We felt, again, very strongly that as close to the people as we could make this board, the better. And so with that, very few, aside from being a resident and perhaps an age requirement because of the nature of the matters that may come before the body, very few barriers to participation. And again, that was in direct response to what we heard from our community. In terms of the House, OPAT will serve to provide, again, the supports needed to drive this work, but also OPAT is the place where reports will be generated. So as we talk about in our work, oftentimes, we want to know what's going on with, and I know this is a matter before the council now, police overtime, for example. I know Councilor Arroyo is championing that issue. The OPAT would be a body that could be responsible for issuing white papers, policy positions, as well as, of course, making sure that data is released to the public transparently, timely, and in a way that it can be digested. That's what OPAT will do. And that's a responsibility. Again, that's a new responsibility that, again, as we engaged in our research and in our conversations with community, was something that people were really yearning for. I want to ask Jamal Crawford, did you want to weigh in? Is Jamal there?
Well, thank you very much for your summary. Okay. Jamal comes in, he'll be able to, I'll just chime in right in. If he raises, Jamal, if you raise your blue hand, maybe there's a connection issue.
Oh, no, I think it was just a mute. I was just muted. I'm sorry. Okay. Yep. So at the end of the day, I'm gonna try to be really quick and really brief and cover some main things. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your commitment to seeing police reform in some manifestation as we move forward. My sister Tanisha, it's hard to follow that. She really summed up everything. What I would just say is, I'll talk about the spirit. And everything that we saw that, was a traditional problem, right, are the things that we tried to shore up. So that the co-op, one thing, Tanisha, that you may not have mentioned, and all the people that we talked to, is also too our review of what the co-op themselves had said. From every report that they've issued since the very first report, when myself and other activists thought it was a shoo-in because Mayor Menino put this board together and we thought they were just going to rubber stamp everything. But the very first report from the co-op spoke about the lack of their powers, the ineffectiveness of the process, and so on and so forth. And so when looking at all those reports, the latest with the group of, Regina Quinlan, Natasha Tidwell, Larry Mays, right? And we remember when the mayor tried to bump it up from 3 members to 5, and from 10% to 10% sampling of these cases to 20%. There's a lot of nuances in here. People originally thought that the co-op was civilian review. This is where the difference comes in. The co-op was only meant to look at cases that came through internal affairs. What we did is we strengthened and we took away all the complaints that people had always had. Well, they don't have any subpoena power. Well, now under this, they would, under a direct umbrella. They didn't have the power of independent investigation. Well, now they do. The mayor bumped it up from, 10% to 20% sampling. Now the fetters are off. They could look at whatever they want, as much as capacity goes. The need for each thing is because what the people who would provide oversight over internal affairs is very specific. And civilian review is also very specific. So I would just, in my logical mind, say, if the true quest is for police reform, I don't understand the problem with more eyeballs on it. And if we look at the very body of the city council, how many committees are on city council? All of you are experts in a variety of fields, but there's an education committee, there's a public safety committee, because various people, and it's not to say that someone that's not on one committee doesn't have something to add on or what have you, but I want people to really understand the nuance and the difference between having oversight specifically over the internal affairs process, and then also having a broader vision of civilian review, and that they both are able to impact policy, and neither discounts civilian participation or, in fact, I believe that what we created, we have a youth voice. We have, community organizations and civic organizations providing their nominations. We give a voice to city council. So at the end of the day, once again, to expedite this, I would love to see what are the problems with what has already been proposed. And if we're going to get to a marrying point, what can we marry? And the only other thing that I'll say to this, because I'm really trying to be reserved in myself, and God bless you all, but I'm really trying to be reserved in myself because Chairwoman Edwards, you started this off and said, we're not going to do a thing where, who did what first or what's better or whatever. And then I believe, and maybe I'm sensitive, but I believe that we engaged in a wee bit of that. And so now to not return volley, because I don't view this as a adversarial thing, how do we now come together? Like, what's wrong with what we proposed? To the best of my knowledge, this is the best of anything that's been proposed in my 30 years of activism. And I really would love to hear arguments against whatever's proposed so we can get into the nitty gritty and get to it.
Thank you. So just to my colleagues, that is not what I'm going to engage in, what's wrong with either proposal. I want to be clear to those, to all people on here. We, as the city council, we pass ordinances. And so the question is, what ordinance and how of the two that are on the table in front of us? The executive orders are not in front of us. We have no impact or influence on an executive order. The mayor did that without the city council. That's not before us. To make the Civilian Review Board permanent and legally within our ordinances, it has to pass through. So what gets codified is really the question before us, not what's wrong with anything, but what gets codified. And so, again, I want to, we have several components to this, and I'm trying my best to make sure that we're as organized in our discussion of each of these components. And so again, to my colleagues, you have many documents in front of you. I would recommend looking at the administration comparison chart, as well as the comparison chart from Councillor Campbell. At this point, I think what I'd like to do is have the exchange or the questions, if they have any particular questions about the OPAT structure and the ordinance proposed by the administration. If you have any questions about that, I'd like for my colleagues to go ahead and do that and ask those questions. And we're going to go in order of arrival, and I will keep this round of questions to 3 minutes each, because we have a lot of people here and they have a lot to say. And if you use your 3 minutes to do an opening remark and to pontificate and do whatever you want to do, and don't ask any questions, that's your 3 minutes. But we're going to get through this. And so, because we have so much before us. Very well then, so in terms of order of arrival, we'll start with Councillor Braden. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, I apologize. I had to step off to take a call, and I will waive my time to the next. In the interest of timeliness, please proceed with the next questions from the next person.
Thank you, Councillor Bach.
Sorry, Councillor Edwards, I'm just having an issue with my connectivity. Yeah, I guess here, I'll jump, sorry, figured it out. Thank you so much. I won't go to an opening statement. I'll just jump right into just asking the administration. So I think to me, to Councillor Edwards' point about codification, there's an initial question about why the administration didn't opt to codify the Civilian Review Board. Because, and I mean, I know why we need OPAT codified, but it just seems to me like we're now stuck with a sort of two-level conversation, which is about putting the CRB into law at all, and then also the ways in which the proposed CRB from my colleagues and the one from the task force are different. And I'm just sort of wondering, I understand the speed aspect of an executive order, but there's then the question of, I think our council default would be to follow that up with putting it into law so that it lasts regardless of administration. And just would love to hear a little bit from the administration about why you haven't gone that route.
Councillor, thank you for the question. When the mayor accepted the task force reports, I think on multiple press conferences, and it's been stated in the news that the mayor was going to use every tool available to him to move the task force recommendations forward. The mayor also said that he was going to fully accept the task force's recommendations. He did not weigh in, he did not change them, he brought them forward, and he said he was going to use every tool to do that, and he did just that. He has within his power to create the old co-op was created through an executive order. He changed that into the IOP through executive order, and he created the Civilian Review Board, which are within his powers to do so, and that was done 2 weeks ago. The one thing that he does have to do through council and through ordinance is a creation of the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, because it's a new city administration commission, and because the council needs to approve subpoena power. And so that is why, as we are looking at the ways of doing things and consulting the task force about the steps that he was going to take, this is the decision that he landed on for, again, for speed and expediency. And so I think you answered the question. You answered the question as you were asking the question. That was our mindset about how we did it this way.
So my follow-up on that, Jerome, would just be, would the mayor and the administration support the, like, if we also had before us, in addition to the OPAT ordinance, an ordinance from you all that just codified exactly what was in the executive order about the Civilian Review Board. Let's say hypothetically for a moment that the differences are not there, that you're not talking about my colleague's ordinance. would the administration be in favor? Obviously, you don't think it's necessary under this current mayor because you've done an executive order, but would the administration be in favor, or would it be opposed or indifferent to the question of putting exactly what the task force proposed into law through city ordinance?
Yeah, so I think to follow up to your question, Counselor, and if some of the task force members might chime in if I speak out of turn, but it is the mayor's desire to move this issue forward. He believes this work is important. Now, he believes that he chose a path for which this to happen, but as with everything in the legislative body, there are things that have to change. Do we feel as an administration that we would be opposed to codifying a CRB? I don't believe that we would, but I do believe that the administration is going to stand firm in its belief that the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency Commission needs to be created. And so as we work through the working sessions, as we expressed to the chairwoman yesterday, we are willing to sit down in this working session and actually get to work. She set a very short timeline about what she wants to complete this work. I think the administration wants to meet that timeline that she has laid out for the work. But we're going to be very clear that the OPAT structure is something that is very important to the administration. We have a civilian review board currently that was passed. We understand that the council wants to codify that more and make it firm, because a new mayor can come in and say, I don't want to have a CRB. I want to do something different. And the council is concerned about, future administrations. We're willing to have that conversation about how to do a more holistic approach. Absolutely. And I think that that's what working sessions are for. But just to get to your point, the mayor is, the administration is pretty clear that the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency is a must for us to have this sort of collaboration.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and I want to be clear and not to leave the administration out there on this point. And that is, we, and certainly the NAACP weighed in on this particular issue. It was critically important to us that, as it relates to this issue of policing accountability, that we got done what needed to get done as quickly as possible, because this has been years of advocacy. And so as we looked at the full portfolio of tools available to the mayor from an executive standpoint, we absolutely were advocating for, again, whatever got us across the finish line quickest. Again, because we're impatient on this issue. That being said, I certainly, and this is not speaking as a task force member, I'll speak as president of the NAACP, Councillor Bach, to the extent that there is likewise an appetite by the city council to act expeditiously on this issue and to codify the Civilian Review Board into law and the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel into law, because that has been standing as an executive order for quite some time as well, then fully support that, okay? But what I'm not supportive of is any more back and forth on this, because again, we have waited too long, too much advocacy. This is not new for us in 2020. So if there's an appetite from this body to support policing reform and to support codifying both the Civilian Review Board and the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel into law, based on, again, community voice and input, and really speaking to what the people have been calling for, fully supportive of that.
Great, thank you. I'm sure I've used my time. I'll just say that I start here with a preference both for us to codify the office and do that expeditiously, as you say, and also to codify the Civilian Review Board. And to your point, Tanisha, I definitely think that we don't want to let doing the latter be an enemy of doing the former. But I think that it would be a real step that this body would be taking for a kind of long-term institutionalization of these reforms if we could do both those things. So my next question would be about the provisions. Thank you, Council. Thank you.
Councilor Flynn.
Good afternoon, Councilor Edwards. I have no questions or no statement. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you to the administration staff and members of the task force.
Thank you. Counselor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, thank you for everyone who is here and for the dedication and commitment to this work that's before us, both from the administration and the task force and colleagues on the council. I have not had an opportunity to read those comparisons, so I've been digging through them in my inbox here on and off screen. So we'll perhaps have questions in the second round as I read them. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Counselor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I will say there's always been an appetite, at least on the council side, this particular term, to pass an ordinance to establish a civilian review board and to codify it. What the lead sponsors wanted to hear from the administration, and we had been in conversations with them as well, was a commitment from them, which goes back to Councilor Bach's question of codifying this and not doing it via executive order. That's how we left it in our last conversation, and then we didn't hear anything. So I'm all for it. I think what we need to hear is that there is a commitment from the administration to codify this, and that if we do pass it, of course, that the mayor will sign it. We have yet to get that on public record in a public hearing such as this. So that is very important. And I think just putting my lawyer hat on, an executive order is not as strong legally as an ordinance. So I think it's critically important that it be done via an ordinance. And if there's a commitment to that, wonderful. My second point is in response to the two layers. So you have the board that is reviewing the internal affairs cases, and then a separate board, of course, reviewing citizen complaints. Putting aside the bureaucracy that I think it creates, in looking at best practices, as well as New York, and New York actually came to our hearing and participated in that conversation on our ordinance at the time. And we specifically talked to them. We spoke to former co-op members. I've been in touch with Natasha Tidwell for a long time, Larry Mays for a long time, many others, that best practices say that for even internal affairs cases, it is critically important to have lay citizens also be at the table alongside experts in reviewing those cases too. And so the second point is for the administration is, I don't see the need to have the separation, and that there have been others who talked about the value of having a lay citizen be a part of reviewing those cases that we also see internally within the police department. So that's my other point that I think I would love to hear more from the administration about, because we heard the exact opposite when we were talking with folks in our hearing with respect to civilian review board. And I think the other pieces can be worked out. The office itself, everyone agrees you can't do this without an office. We have that in the ordinance. I think there's so many similarities. It's like just crossing teeth. So that's not an issue. It is really the sticking point right now, it seems, is can we get the administration to confirm that they will actually do this via an ordinance and be willing to sign it? And then the second is on this dual system of two different entities, the need to sort of turn it into one, to review all cases and to have experts, including lay citizens, be at the table. And I will tell you, whether it's constituents in my district over the years talking about this particular accountability, whether it's other folks who've hosted conversations, even the former co-op members who of course had conversations about the restrictions in their authority and their effectiveness, folks talked about the value of having a civilian be a part of reviewing those types of cases too.
Thank you, Councilor Campbell. Did you, Jerome or administration, have any? Two questions. You guys gonna sign it?
Well, let me just interject here. I'm not the administration. I'm not the administration.
Hold on, Mr. Control. Let me answer the administration's part, and I'll let you go to the other part. This administration doesn't need the council to call on it to do anything when it comes to police reform. The mayor has already passed two executive orders that the public has asked for regarding a CRB and an IOP. So calling on the mayor to do something is just, I think it's just more politics than anything else. We have before you a department that is supposed to look at the work, that's going to review the police department. We already have a civilian review board and we already have an IOP. I think Mayor Walsh has made it very clear his commitment to police reform, along with 10 other Black and brown individuals in this town who have been working on this for years, who wrote this report that we are carrying forward. So the mayor doesn't need to answer any sort of calling. Now, through this working session, should we be able to come together with something in a document that codifies everything? I think the mayor, as long as we agree to the language, which is going to take some time for us to trade language back and forth, which your office was, we said this very clearly, your chief of staff yesterday, that I would love to change language with you, Counselor. So we are on the record with you already talking about that stuff, as we said it to the chair. So I hope that Counselor Edwards, that we can move forward into the working session and actually start getting into the details, but I'm going to let the task force members respond to the difference between the two boards doing the reviewing.
Well, I just quickly, my chief of staff, yes, talked to you yesterday, Jerome, so that we could be on the same page for the working session and be crystal clear as to where the divide was. But taking it a step back, before the signing of the executive order, Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Mejia and I met with the mayor and the administration to have a conversation about how we could get this done. And we asked for specific write-ups and suggested edits to the language so that we could have this working session and move it forward. We haven't gotten that. So I just want to, on the record, because this is clearly a recorded conversation that people will watch and entertain. We have been waiting for that write-up or the suggested edits. And so we haven't gotten that yet. But instead, of course, we got the executive order, which is fine. You're exactly right. The mayor has the authority and has for a long time to be able to execute on this and get it done. The question now, as we ask the question around executive order versus ordinance, is yes, the council is what clearly has been ready to do the ordinance piece. The question is the administration willing to sort of do that too? Because we could pass it and it could go nowhere. So that's hence my question through the chair to get it as a part of this record.
So and before we go back on that point, I just want to make sure that I'm summarizing and moving this forward so that this is not a volley. What the administration, I understood, said specifically is that there is a commitment to get it done and that they're here to possibly codify something with us. That's what I heard. So with that issue aside, the specific concerns that Councilor Campbell brought up was about the bifurcation. Why two boards? So if someone could speak to that, and then we're going to go on to the next counselor.
I think Jamal and Tanisha are capable of discussing why they split the boards in two.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor, or Tanisha or Jamal. I think Jamal wanted to speak, I
was going to, but you know what? I let me just put this on the record because I'm glad that Councilor Campbell reminded that this is all on the record and all being recorded. So let me just, for the record, say I don't like the tone of this conversation. So I'm going to opt out for the rest of it before I get myself and others in trouble, because there's a lot of things being said here that I don't think hold up to the further. If we do further examination on it, I don't think it exactly holds the water that we're doing. But all right. So I'm just going to opt out and I'm going to say less, as the kids say.
Well,
did you speak to the bifurcation?
Yeah, I can, and and I think this is a question that we wrestled with as a subcommittee. I mean, admittedly, when we first started this process, I did not really understand why we needed to, or why, I will say this, why two was the best option, having both the internal affairs oversight as well as the civilian review board. It is through the process that I personally came to the position that this was the best path. And that is because when thinking about, part of our work is, certainly we were all entering this space focused on policing reform that was designed to strengthen public safety, of course, increase transparency and accountability, but also trust. And the trust goes both ways, right? So there was through this process I think, a very thoughtful consideration about the impact of this reform on multiple stakeholders. And so when we looked specifically at, I'll start with the internal affairs piece. When we look specifically at internal affairs, what we recognized very quickly was that the type of cases that would come, or files that would likely come before that body, could be highly sensitive, could require, not always, but could require a level of experience, as I mentioned earlier, experience and exposure to law enforcement and the ways of policing. And also could, because again, of the nature of those types of those types of files, these are not, and it's important to note this, these are not primary investigations of the issue. These are reviews of essentially internal affairs, right, and their decisions. So given kind of the very specialized, specific, narrow scope of that type of work, we did feel that it was, and also I should say, and also based on our conversations with both current and former co-op members, that we felt very strongly that from a structural standpoint, keeping the IA review separate from the civilian review scope would, one, help to ensure integrity in the process, trust in the process. Also, again, kind of the level of rigor in the process that we thought would be important, again, for a very targeted, narrow scope, reviewing essentially cases that were managed by internal affairs. Very narrow in scope, right? One piece of this oversight that we felt, again, taking into consideration all stakeholders, that we felt would be appropriate to pull out, to keep out, I should say. Civilian Review Board. And I want to say, and there are lay people, civilians on each of these bodies. These are all residents. The current co-op has lawyers on it and also has non-lawyers on it. So they're not even all members of the legal community. But they are individuals who have experience within and with law enforcement, okay? The Civilian Review Board, again, we wanted to make sure that there was, again, an opportunity for as much participation as possible by members of the community, regardless of what neighborhood they live in, regardless of what their background is, regardless of their exposure. These are just whoever lives in the city, who's passionate about this work, who wants to give their time in this way. We wanted to create this opportunity, make sure that opportunity was there for them, and that they had as much of a portfolio, as much as a scope, as wide as a scope as possible. And so with that, again, from a Civilian Review Board standpoint, comprised of civilians, residents of all background, and also having, again, purview over not just direct policing activity and engagement, but also direct purview over, anything that touches policing that they feel needs to be or should be investigated, or not necessarily an investigation, or there should be an inquiry into it. So again, it was a process not for all of us, for me personally, but at the end of that process, really coming to the conclusion that two was appropriate, recognizing specifically kind of the unique elements of internal affairs oversight.
Thank you.
So Counselor Campbell, I'm going to go on to Counselor Mejia.
Yep. Thank you.
Counselor Mejia, then Counselor Janey, then Counselor Arroyo, then Counselor Flaherty.
Yeah, so I first want to just acknowledge that, you know, Jamal, I know I have 3 minutes, and I'm gonna use my 3 minutes however I want. Okay.
Got it.
So I just want to just make note to Jamal, like I really do appreciate your voice, and this is not, you know, I'm hoping that you recognize how much of a value you are to this conversation, and so don't let all of this politicking, you know, get you worked up. So lean into it. Anyways, I personally also have to say that all of this is leaving a really bad taste in my own mouth, because I feel like everybody got a skin in this game, and it seems like everybody at this point, and I'm gonna be honest, it just seems like about who's gonna get the credit for passing this civilian review board, right? And it doesn't seem like it's about the people. It just feels to me like it's all about the politics, and we need to stop. And I don't want to feel like anybody's pawn in this big game of chess, right? So let's just kind of like name it, because that is the elephant in the room, and it seems like everybody's like doing all this, that, or the other. Let's just get real about what's happening here. For me, I don't believe that the argument about passing something quickly, because we need to pass something that is going to ensure that the work of police justice is being done, period, right? We didn't get this far to then just try to get to the finish line and see who got there first. So let's be really thoughtful about how we get there and making sure that we're thorough in that process. Let's not forget that. And the last thing, I just wanna, for me, and I'm eager to move beyond this us versus them mentality, which is clear to me, this is what is at play right now, is that for me, here are a few deal breakers, right? For one, we need to have youth voice on this panel, and that needs to be stated in whatever ordinance we pass. And how do we see youth and young people in this space, and how can we state that in whatever it is that we end up passing? You know, we on our board, we talk about we'll be trained yearly in anti-racist and racial equity training. And how can we ensure that the people that are appointed to serve on these boards are properly trained in anti-racist behavior? And one thing that I'd like to advocate for is stronger powers to issue disciplinary recommendations. How can we work cooperatively to make recommendations of a CRB a reality? Those are the things that I want to just throw out. I don't know if those are questions, some of them are statements, but I'd like to hear how can we get to a good place.
Madam Chair, through you back to the counselor. Counselor, those are all great points. I want to point out that the administration is in agreement with you. I think that both in our presentation and in the current executive order and in also your council ordinance, we have both designated that a nominee be selected from a youth organization. So I do think that we support you in that mission of allowing young people to be more at the table and to be involved in this process. So I think we agree on that. As far as training, I think both in your ordinance and in our OPAT and our CRB executive order, we also both list very comprehensive training of which we require. So I think, again, it just requires us to do a comparison side by side to see where we're both at. But I think we both agree with you there on the need for comprehensive training and repeated training, so that it doesn't, you get trained and then like 4 years later, it kind of goes out of your brain. It should be something that happens regularly, annually, as you said. So I think we're in agreement there. And I apologize, I forgot the third one. What was the third one you asked about?
Disciplinary. Increased disciplinary.
Okay, so unfortunately, due to police contracting, none of these boards can discipline police officers. All in the contract, all discipline is through the police commissioner. And so what these boards can do is refer discipline to the commissioner, but ultimately at the end, the authority for disciplining officers lies solely with the police commissioner.
Right, I think and I appreciate Chief Smith for a few more days. Chief Smith, I appreciate you going over that and kind of lifting up those elements. of the recommendations. That said, I do want to, Councilor Mejia, just pick up on something else that you mentioned, and I want to be clear, and I apologize if in the process of my trying to be brief, if it has been misconstrued in any way. I want to be clear that this work, the recommendations that were made to the mayor and also shared with community, were not made in haste. They are well-researched, well-grounded in research, documented research. And when I speak about expediency, what I'm talking about is literally the decades of advocacy on this issue, and so many others, quite frankly, that often return to us void. And so in this moment in 2020, what we know from an advocacy standpoint, from an activist standpoint, is that our window is only open for so long. And so to the extent we were able to, again, after well-documented research and diligence, come up with recommendations on this particular issue that we knew could be implemented, or at least start the implementation sooner rather than later. That was and will continue to be what we press for on behalf of our communities.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. I just am very, because I feel like this is the first time where we had an opportunity to even talk about these things, right? And all of a sudden, we're going to have to try to get to, in the next hour and whatever change we have left, to get to an agreement. So that is, for me, is what feels a little bit rushed. And I think that if we're going to make a commitment to something, then we need to be able to unpack it and do our due diligence to making sure that whatever it is that we sign up to doesn't feel rushed. This to me feels rushed right now. But I do appreciate, Chief, your point in terms of youth organization. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll have, I just want it to be really explicit that, that we want a young person there, and that we have some conversation on what that will look like. And then I don't see anything in the ordinance specifically naming anti-racist training. So I think that that could be just something that we can just tweak a little bit, just to make sure that we're very explicit about what it is that we're asking for, and whatever ordinance makes it to the finish line. Thank you.
And to the point on the youth, if, I think that, both if we're referring to the Civilian Review Board, our executive order and your ordinance with Councilor Campbell and Councilor Royal, we both kind of list organizations. And we both have, I think the mayor is in agreement that there should be some appointments that are solicited from the council. So we can figure out, I think, through the working session and trading of language, how we make you more comfortable with the youth language. And I think the administration is open to having some trading of language dialogue so that we can get narrowed down to your concern, to ensure that someone from the young population has a seat at the table. So we're open to the exchanging language on that.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
We're going to go on to
All right.
Councilor Janey.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'll be very quick. I have a 2 o'clock and won't be able to stay on the call long. Just some questions. I want to thank certainly the makers of both ordinances, and thank you. Many thanks to Tanisha Sullivan and Jamal Crawford, who I hope to hear from later. I know he said he wanted to say less, but I think it's important that we hear from him in particular. I had a couple of questions. One, I want to state right off the bat that I think it is incredibly important that we get the CRB codified into law. It is not enough to leave it to executive order. So I want to say that right off the bat. We need to make sure that whatever we pass, that we are passing something that codifies the CRB. The questions, I'm curious. I support the youth nominees. I think that's all important. I'm curious around other nominees. Who on the council nominates? Is it committee chair? Is it president? And then how are all nominees, whether council or mayor, confirmed? Training around, I support obviously the anti-racist training, and I would say, I'd go a step further and say anti-Black, racist training that we need to get. I saw in the chart though that there was training being offered by the Boston Police Department, and I'm just wondering about how we draw upon the expertise from the Boston Police Department, but not overstep and recreate many of the problems that we're trying to avoid by having, the police department do the training. I have a question about the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency and how that relates to internal affairs. Just what the structure, the relationship is there. And I'll leave it there. I'm not sure I'll be able to join for a second round because I have the other commitment, but very interested in this issue. It's very important. And I feel like it's been a long time coming, that it isn't rushed. I think we do need to take the time and care to get something good done. But this has been a long time. So training questions, how and why BPD, like what role BPD will play in the training, who will confirm the nominees, and then what's the role and relationship between internal affairs and the Office of Accountability and Transparency. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'll answer the president's question about appointments, then I'll turn to my colleagues for the other in-depth. Madam President, I think it would be viewed similarly to how we viewed working with you on other appointments. The body, the council, would have to talk amongst the council about how they would funnel appointments up to the president's office. And then the president representing the body would then say, Mr. Mayor, here are the council's appointments to said board. I think that is how we're viewing it, both through the way the mayor is currently envisioning a CRB. And I'm not quite sure of the process that the council ordinance currently lays out. But I think that is our vision. It is the whatever we decide as topics. What we struggled with was, at first, I think the task force, I sat in the meeting and they try to be specific about, well, this seat will be for this person, this seat will be for that person. And then I think that we noticed that it's sometimes hard to fill a seat, and the council may have a name of an individual, but they don't fit that niche spot, right? But you still want to get them on. And so what we were looking for in working with the council is to have the characteristics of which seat be more, you can pull from these areas, right? And so instead of saying the council gets the youth seat, the neighborhood association seat, the law enforcement seat, or whatever, it would be a defined that the council and the mayor will pull from this universe, and that from that universe will supply said boards. But again, the view is that the council, however you choose to organize yourselves, would bubble up through the president's office to notify the mayor that these were the council selections. And I think that that's how we're envisioning it. And we'll work with Chairwoman Edwards on fine tuning that language.
Can you speak to confirmation though? So that's how we nominate. How do we confirm?
Well, the mayor.
Is it through the council?
It'll just be appointments by the mayor.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a, just to be clear, in the language of the executive order and what I'm saying right now in the ordinance, there is no bubbling up and coming to a committee of the city council. It's just the mayor for the internal affairs. So
yeah,
that's it.
And so if there are nominees, so I just want to play this out. So if there are nominees that come from the council that the mayor doesn't agree with, then what happens if there's no confirmation power?
There's no nomination from the council from what I can see. It's
So
just
That's not what I see on the comparison. So what am I looking at? Am I looking at a wrong document?
you might be looking at Councilor Campbell's versus the administration's.
For clarification, the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel, the former co-op, the structure of the appointment process for that, there was not a recommendation to change it. And so that is currently mayoral appointment only. For the Civilian Review Board, and that I'm not sure if that's what you're looking at, President Janey, that does explicitly provide for council voice.
Yes, that's the one I'm looking at. I just pulled it up. It says appointment and composition. It's the first topic in the grid.
Yeah. So I guess, Madam President, that would be something that we would look to work at in this working session. And as we change languages with your committees, is how you would like to do that, whether or not whatever number we agree on to be the council nominated appointees. Right now, the mayor says 3 and he has 6. You guys have 6 and he has 5. So whatever number, right? So whatever number, so say like, I don't know, 4 or 5, whatever. Whether or not the council wants to, all right, we have 4 seats that are council seats, Here are 8 names, Mayor, pick 4. I think we're open to that conversation. If you just want to say, we have 4 seats, here's our 4 seats, I think we are open to that conversation. I don't think we are trying to dictate how the council selects their appointments. Again, I think that that's something that the body itself could figure out. And you guys make appointments all the time to various things. So I think it would just be a conversation you must about how you would want to choose yours. But ultimately they're appointments of the mayor, but we would receive your appointments. Similar to how we got names from you, Madam President, for the Cannabis Control Board. You nominated a bunch of people. We selected some names from that list that you gave us. So there's different ways that we could do this. And we would look to work with the council on what they think is best to govern themselves.
Can anyone just speak to the other 2 points on the training and on the relationship with IA before, I know my time must be running up.
Sorry, I can respond to that. I may need you to refresh my recollection on the specific training question, but with respect to internal affairs, are you asking, is there a direct relationship between OPAT and IA?
Asking what is the relationship? What is each doing? How do they relate to each other? Who oversees what? Like just the whole 9. And then on the training, just to be clear, in the grid, I'm looking at the comparison between.
I don't know that I have that, so.
Okay, it's the 3rd box down, and it just talks on the mayor's side, it says broadly encompassing to be designed by OPAT in collaboration with the Equity Office and the BPD. And so I'm just wondering what that was. In the other ordinance, it says specified in the ordinance, which I'd have to kind of dig deeper
Yeah.
into.
So look, and I think this also came up in Councilor Mejia's comments as well. When it comes to training, absolutely, we want to make sure that whoever's participating in, not just in this process, arguably everybody within who's touching city government is going through rigorous training. I don't think that for our part, one of the things that we were intentional about not doing was to be too prescriptive, right, in our recommendations. We wanted to provide a solid enough framework that provided guidance to get us on the right path, but we also did not want to be prescriptive in what we were designing, recognizing that ultimately there'll be an executive director and a team, a professional team that will be responsible for this work. And we, again, didn't want to be prescriptive. That said, I don't think that there would be any pushback if it were the will of this body and of the administration to be explicit about the type of training. I mean, I'm a racial justice advocate. If you want to put anti-racist training, or President Janney, as you said, what did you say? Black training in it, that's what we do. So certainly supportive of it and encouraged that is the way that you're thinking about this. With respect to internal affairs, it's important to note that the OPAT, the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, that would house the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel, is completely separate from the BPD. Okay. And in being separate from the BPD, it's separate from internal affairs. It is truly designed, and if this is not clear, let's make it more clear. It is truly designed to be an separate, independent oversight body. And I think that's why it's also important to have this separate office, because we don't even want the budget. We don't even want the same people having, budgetary responsibility for, or the same person having budgetary responsibility for both entities, right? So separate by envision and separate in design. The role of the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel is truly oversight. It's review of what's happening in internal affairs. With this new design of internal affairs oversight, it expands the scope of their purview, of that panel's purview, and really gives them the opportunity. When we think about the Sean Ellis case, right? Literally, the IAOP today could reach into internal affairs and pull those records and say, we want to review those. Today, they can do that. A month ago, they could not. Today they can, based on the design that we've put forward, right? And they would have the opportunity to reach in, pull those files because of the subpoena, either BPD can deliver them, or BPD could be subject to, Internal Affairs could be subject to a subpoena that would require those files to be turned over to the panel and for the panel to be able to review and make a determination as to whether there's further investigation needed or if things were, were done appropriately. So separate entities, independent entities by design. And again, if that's not clear, absolutely, let's make that clear.
Yeah, and Madam President, to Tanisha's point also, I just wanted to point out that Dr. Carolyn Crockett is spending a large amount of her time looking at the administration as a whole, but she is deep dive now into BPD regarding the training. And I think that that's why the task force wanted to give that space to see what she was going to do over there, because she's trying now to have BPD stand up the new diversity and inclusion division in BPD, which was another recommendation of the task force, that they have a diversity and inclusion division in BPD. So she is going to be, whatever we decide on the training here, it's going to be her baby that she carries over and ensures that it's implemented over on that side. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all.
So we're going to go on to Counselor, and I know Counselor Savage-George, you raised your hand. I don't know if that was for something in particular, but if it's to do your 3 minutes, I'm going to go to the other.
It wasn't my 3 minutes, but it was just a clarifying question on Counselor Janey's question regarding the council appointments. Would we be required, or should we be required to make sure there's language included in any which ordinance that specifies how the council would decide those appointments? I think that's important when we think about council appointments, just where it was so directly related to her questions. That's why I raised my hand. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Counselor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would just agree with the point just raised by Counselor Savage-George and originally raised by Counselor President Janey regarding the appointment structure and what that nomination is, and having that clearly delineated in whatever we finalize. I'm going to ask specific questions about how this office is going to operate, because I think we've spent a lot of time talking about just a bunch of different things. And for me, I'm less interested in the credit and the who and the what. I could care so little about that. Where I'm at is I want an effective office. I want it to work. And so when we talk about two separate offices, these are the questions that I have that you may be able to allay or may continue to be questions. The first one is caseloads, right? When we're talking about two separate boards, looking at two separate amount of work, two separate different things, right? One's in internal affairs, the other one has these other tasks that they're tasked with investigating and doing work on. What does that workload look like? Do we have some idea based on what co-op was, what we believe co-op would have been looking at? I know this isn't co-op, it's a recreation of that, but do we have some idea as to how many cases we're putting in front of each respective board? Are we gonna have one overworked, overburdened board and one that doesn't have that? Are we going to have two equally burdened boards? Do we know what that looks like? So that's one question. The other one that from a practicality standpoint, it strikes me that we could have an officer who's under investigation on an internal affairs situation on one side, and that same officer can be under investigation on the other side. And I'm not aware how that communication would be happening in the current construct, so that one board is aware, oh, we might have a separate issue over here that we should be looking at as well. What happens in that situation? Because I haven't seen that. There was a question about subpoenas and subpoena power, which is obviously incredibly important. And there was a check system that I believe was introduced. I don't know if it's in the final here, and so I'm interested in just seeing where we landed on this, where basically 2 out of the 3 entities would have to agree on a subpoena. In other words, if the Civilian Review Board wanted a subpoena, they would have to convince at least one of the co-op or OPAT, right? Which is not co-op, it's IOP or whatever it is. But they would have to convince one of those 2 individuals, whoever that individual is for the other board, to agree to a subpoena, and vice versa. If they wanted one, they would have to go and convince the Civilian Review Board and or the Central Executive Director. I just have a lot of questions as to how that would work in terms of just two things. One, how it works on a practical sense, but two, how we're taxing this central administrative body. Because that's what the ordinance essentially does. It creates an executive director who doesn't really seemingly have skin in the game on either board, so much as their job is to facilitate making the work possible for both of those boards. And so the reality is that one of the issues I've had here is sort of stretching that central staff. Instead of working with one board, working with one group, they're now working with two separate groups, and they're now using their employees to work on both sides, which could create more workload and make them less effective. And so those are the questions that I have that are more practical to the administration aspect of that. Because to be perfectly frank, when we talk about subpoena power and one side or the other side, both ordinances give that power. When we talk about, what you're looking into, I don't think there's anything that our ordinance isn't looking into that this ordinance wouldn't be looking into, and these two executive orders wouldn't be looking into. The question is just in the administrative makeup of that, how that's taking place. And so for me, those are the practical questions. I'm happy to ask them again if you didn't take notes, but those are the kind of the questions that I have about how those bodies would interact with this central office.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Counselor, I think those are very good questions, and I'm glad that we're able to get into the kind of the meat. And I know this is something that you and I have chatted before on this, right? And I wasn't clear earlier. So I think that with the task force members, I think that hopefully we can finally answer this for you. They are two separate boards. We do not believe, by the amount of caseload currently coming into the co-op, understanding that they were restricted only 20% of the cases, right, of random cases. Now it's open up to all. So we do intend to see both boards getting a number of work, right? And so there will be an increase in the IOP. You are correct to call that, but we do not believe that it's going to be the IOP side will be as a significant number. We believe that the CRB is probably going to be where the bulk of the work is going to grow. And what I can do is work with Fernando to get you how many cases, like what's the caseload per current co-op member, right? So I will commit to you today that I make sure that I get you that number so that you have a good sense and understanding about how much IOP is going to get. Because it's not even though there's going to be a growth, I do not foresee it being kind of a burdensome growth, right? And plus we expanded IOP to have a couple more members so they could get more caseload. But it's not, we truly feel as though the Civilian Review Board, whatever structure comes out, is going to be the bulk of the work. And so that is why I think it was important that we have an executive director sit down and start building out the staff. And the task force is very clear. This is not going to be what we've seen in city government where we sign up one poor executive director and then give them two staff people and then say, go off and go save the world, right? This actually has to be a robust commission, kind of like we have with I wouldn't say ISD level because that's like mega, right? But it's going to have to be kind of like our licensing board where they have 15 to 20 people who do all the work. But when you think about what the task force required, we need to have investigators. We need to have caseworkers. We need to have statisticians who are building up a database that works with BPD to put all the database onto the public. So this is going to be a robust department of a lot of FTEs. And I think that we're looking to have that conversation with the council through the budget process to make sure that this thing is fully funded and that we actually that the executive director appears before the council body and says, I need 32 FTEs in order to fulfill the work that the council and the mayor wants us to do in this office, and then have a discussion about how we fund that department. So I think you are asking the right questions about caseload. So let me get actual real data to you, and I'll commit to getting that to you in the next couple of days so that you can answer that question. And on the other ones, I'm going to turn it over to Tanisha and to the rest of the task force so they can talk about the inner workings, because I think I muddled it on you last time. So I'll let them be more clear for you.
Thank you.
And Allison is here as well.
Extremely briefly about Councilor Arroyo, the question you have regarding the workload. I think probably, as you know, as a former public defender, as I am, we won't know until people really start taking advantage of this office. That's why we wanted to make it accessible to the public. in my almost 30 years as a criminal defense attorney and a public defender, the majority of complaints that I get, that we see from our clients, aren't necessarily regarding to the fact that they were arrested. It's how they were treated. It's how they were abused by police. Most people, most clients do not go and file complaints. They only think that will exacerbate their problems. So with the way we have this structured, we are hopeful that people will take advantage. They will come in. If they have a complaint, they will file it. If they need to do an internal affairs complaint, those always take longer. They can file that. We can have dual complaints in both of these offices taking place at the same time. The difference being is that the Civilian Review Board portion should move along a lot faster because we will have more control over that versus whatever is taking place within the police department and what you have with respect to your contractual obligations and so on and so forth. But the Civilian Review Board portion can do its work even if there's another complaint taking place in internal affairs. Once people take advantage of this, if the community is coming in, is filing more complaints, then that's why we give this agency the power. If you need to have more employees, so be it. If you don't, oh, that's okay too. But we do want to see people taking advantage of this. We want to have a better police department. We want to have better community policing to the extent that we can. And that's what we're hopeful in doing with the way we have set this up. So I just want to put it out there that we don't know what we're going to get. I have clients who would, in the past, would refuse to go and file complaints. Maybe now they will take advantage of that. And that's what we're hoping for. I just want to put that out there.
Thank you.
So Councilor Arroyo, to your questions about, and I know Jamal's still here. Jamal, anytime you want to come in. With respect to your questions around, I think you had a question about the commissioners and the subpoena power.
Yeah, so I think, so just to make it clear, I had two questions. One was on the subpoena issue. I know that we had talked about sort of the check of one group would have to get one of the other two to agree. And
Right.
I just want to know how that would work. How much of the case would, what case would have to be made by one person on one side to this group? Do they have to give them access to files they've never seen? What is the process to get that permission? And how public is that conversation, right?
Right.
We
So
wanted
the
this subpoena and they didn't give it to us.
Right. Again, you are the technocrat on this one, and we know how close it is to your profession. So I appreciate the questions. With respect to the subpoena power, that too is something that we heavily debated as a body in terms of how that should work. And just to be very frank about it, we take that very seriously, and we did not want to create a structure whereby you had subpoenas flying all over the place. And so in order to try to have, as again, kind of respect the integrity of the process, engender trust in that process, so people don't feel like it's a gotcha and other people aren't feeling like it has no teeth, we designed a structure where the subpoena power would be held by 3 commissioners, and this is what you're describing. They would be in their by role. So the executive director, who, as you aptly noted, is not attached to any one of the oversight bodies, the chair of the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel, and the chair of the Civilian Review Board. And in order for there to be any subpoena issued out of the office, it is true that at least two of them must agree that a subpoena is justified in this instance. They would be presented with, kind of the file, the documentation supporting the need for a subpoena. Again, we were not prescriptive in how that would work, but presumably, obviously this is not a court of law, but presumably, it would include, documentation of the requests that have gone to the BPD for information. It would include, kind of, the time parameter, the time that has lapsed. It would include all of the documentation to demonstrate that every, attempt has been made to give BPD the time it needed to respond, and that BPD has been non-responsive. It could presumably work very similar to the subpoena power that the council holds, right? In terms of what, those things that you look for as a body when it comes to issuing a subpoena. But net, what we wanted to make sure was most important to us was that we created a structure whereby there is, some control over the issuance of subpoenas, and that when they are issued, it will be after thoughtful deliberation. That was very important to the majority of the task force. With respect to OPAT, I think it's important to, when you think about the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, and Chief Smith mentioned this at the top, that is the office, okay? Within the office, you have what are the equivalent of departments. One is the Internal Affairs wing, and the other is the Civilian Review wing, okay? And so when we talk about resources, actually from a budgetary standpoint, and from an efficiency standpoint, having the resources, be they investigative resources, mediation resources, communications resources. One of the things that we heard very loudly from New York, from their oversight body, was that the communications piece was key, certainly recognizing multiple languages, as well as just consistency of outreach, right? When we think about the research support, the technical supports, having them under one umbrella, the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, supporting what is essentially akin to two departments, is efficient. And it does bear in mind, again, from a budgetary standpoint, again, getting kind of the greatest return. It is, again, kind of by design. I also want to note, you mentioned about the ED. Under the umbrella of the OPAT, and kind of reporting to the executive director, will be like your mediation folks, because we need that in our communities, right? It would be the researchers, the information specialists. That kind of that staffing line will, again, there will be specialists providing support to both of the wings, if you will, but they will also be, if the vision becomes reality, right, they will also be responsible for producing reports for public consumption, right? They will also be the ones who are pulling data from the BPD on police stops, FIOs. They'll be in publicly releasing the data with routinely, not like every 3 years. They will be the ones producing the reports as it relates to, presume it could be overtime. It could be anything that as a community, we believe, and that's all of us, we believe we should know about, and that we want to have insight on. So there will be, the vision here and the design here is for there to be staffing to support that type of work as well. So it's not just about cases, it's also about information sharing here.
No, and I think all of that's really important. I know I've probably hit my 3 minutes. The one question I didn't get an answer to that I would love an answer at some point is what happens when an officer is being investigated simultaneously? How much communication are the two boards allowed to have with one another in the event that occurs? I would hate to have one investigation stall out while there's relevant information in another group. And
Yeah,
so
so
that's
I apologize.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I apologize. I meant to answer that. So, and this goes, again, the door to transparency and accountability under this structure is the office. And so someone walks into the office and, you know, they file a complaint, or again, the Internal Affairs Oversight Panel initiates a review, or the Civilian Review Board initiates something. The office under the executive director will be monitoring, right? And tracking what's coming into the office. So the file for an IA review might not be readily available to anyone who wants access to it, but it will be documented within the office that there is, you know, a review of X file, right? And so if that's in the system, hopefully technology working, you know, the office would be able to actively monitor if you've got something going on, you know, in IA, as well as something going on within civilian review.
But would the boards know?
I think that's something that I would say it would have to depend, right? And I'm just throwing that out there. When I put on my lawyer hat, you know, I can think of, you know, it would probably be more likely that IA would know something, the IA panel knows that something's going on with civilian review than civilian review knowing what's going on in IA. Because depending upon the nature of the IA investigation or review, there might be privacy concerns. So that's why I say, I would say it would depend.
And Councilor, you raise a good point, and I think this is something that should come up when the executive director is formulating rules and regulations.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. There's been one counselor who has been waiting to actually ask some questions, Counselor Flaherty. I think he's still on, so I'd like to get him in. And then I have also questions too, before we go deeper into this. And no, I think this is excellent. This is exactly where you want to be in a working session, but still wanted to allow him. Counselor Flaherty, are you still here?
Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair. Obviously, good afternoon, everybody. And this has obviously been very productive and helpful conversation. Let me first start off by thanking the people who've been doing the work and have done the work. The representatives, obviously, they're in front of us, but also, you know, their allies out in the community that for years have been, you know, very active and helpful in this space. And a shout out specifically to Allison Cartwright, the fact that she's involved in this along with Jerome and Tanisha and Jamal gives me a comfort level and a trust. Just given my 25-year relationship with Allison, we go back to Roxbury District Court, and she's always been everything for the right reasons. And the fact that she's here gives me tremendous comfort in knowing that as we move forward, it's been thoughtful and it's been deliberative, and then we're also making sure that we're taking everything into consideration. And so with that, I appreciate her being on here, and hope to at some point, sometime, see her on the bench at some point in time. But I have a couple specific questions. I would like to know the proposed budget for both of them. I'd like to get an understanding of the monies available on the investigative side of the house, and also want to just talk about obviously the body camera issue. And it's my understanding that the film footage expires after 30 days. And you know, I always like to, even in Boston, you like to have a defined start and a defined finish to things. You know, whether it's a development project or it's something with our schools, you just want to have a degree of predictability. You don't want it falling into the abyss. And I know investigations, they take a significantly long time and arguably too long. And I really think that we have an opportunity here to, you know, have sort of put a defined start and a defined finish to obviously the complaint being lodged within a specific period of time, and then the investigation ensues. And then within a relatively short period of time, there's clarity, or there's a decision or a judgment made. And then, you know, it is what it is, and/or we move forward. And too often that doesn't happen. You know, the IAB in particular, people complaints languish. It's a huge disservice to everything, and really speaks to the credibility of the process. So I'd like to speak maybe to that. And, you know, will there be a defined process, you know, a start date and a finish date for all investigations, so that there is a degree and a level of predictability to the process, and there'll be a result in a relatively expedited fashion. Clearly, obviously, things get complicated. Investigations may take a while, but best efforts need to be made to make this process move as quickly as possible, from my perspective. So, those are some of the questions that I have, and I had very similar questions to previous speaker, Councilor Arroyo, and that I think Tanisha did a great job in answering in terms of the both of the organizations and what are they going to know from each other, and should they know, should they not know, what are they going to share, what are they not going to share. So I think that was helpful to go through Councilor Arroyo's line of inquiry, which shed some light for me.
Council Flaherty, then Madam Chair, through you to back to the councilor. I think that's a great question. As far as budget, I would have to say that we aren't there yet. What we wanted to do in our thinking, again, and now we're open to this larger discussion with your body, is that we can appoint an executive director now, right? We could hire an individual, but we wanted that person in place before we built the department. We felt that it would be inappropriate to build a department and put a budget together on what we thought the budget would be, and then drop an executive director in it, especially since it's new. So our goal was to see what the council was willing to pass, get an agreement with the council that we all agree upon that this will be the new commission, get an executive director, and then have them build it out with the guidance that the task force has laid out about you need to look at this for a regulation, you look at that. So there's a very clear thing about timings of cases. The task force, even the council, which I think is great, put timelines about when cases should be done. We should also look at what the task force did, because I think the task force actually gave us shorter timelines. And they scheduled those out. And so those will all become in the regulations. So for the budget, I think that would be the next thing that we would present to the council. Once we get an understanding of what an agreement is within the ordinance, we'll be able to then put pen to paper. And I think the budget department is already kind of sketching out, but I don't have an official thing to present you. But I think that will be very soon. The council will be able to see what we anticipate a budget, and then having that discussion. And then I'll turn over to my colleagues if they have an answer to some of the other questions that you laid out. But those are the things. Oh, and sorry, one thing before they jump in, the Councilor Royal's thing, I'm sorry, Councilor Edwards, I'm just jumping in really quickly. What Councilor Royal had said was, we're worried about, so we think that through regulation, since the OPAT executive director will be the central point of all of the internal departments, and they can put regulations about how the boards are going to speak to each other, because we also have to be very mindful of DA investigations, right? And we are never going to know when the DA is doing an investigation into a police officer. So we have to be very careful that we step back from certain jurisdictions who have authority in the space and then let them finish their business. Then we can take their work and add it onto our work and go in further. So that was kind of our mindset there. I apologize for interrupting.
Thank you. It's okay, I'm gonna go ahead and go through my questions as well, so we can start to get back through, and then also possibly get through a comparison or start to look at this specific civilian review board proposals. Couple things. I just wanted to note that there is not agreement on the overall ability to create these offices or these processes through executive order. So but that existed way before this conversation. That existed a long time ago, and dealing with the whether the mayor can create an office and reorganize government without the council, and so on and so forth. So there is not an actual agreement there. Hopefully it's going to be irrelevant, because we're going to go through this process through an ordinance and get it done. So I just wanted to note that. Number one. Number two, they also, I'm just checking to make sure I understand the rules, or the council rules and charter again. But if we take no action on this as a council, the mayor may be able to have this, I think, done automatically within 60 days anyway. So that the council needs to make a decision on the mayor's ordinance, up, down, amend, or something. But something needs to happen. It can't not just be left out in the ether. So I want to be clear about the role that the council has to do in the next 3 weeks to my colleague. And then I wanted to go into the specifics of the OPAT. So there's some things, I mean, I do, and it was a great breakdown from Tanisha of the two offices and how they work together, the scope, the narrow, I thought it was much more broad for the internal affairs, but the narrow scope is review of review. It's almost a watchdog of how they watch themselves. And I think that is necessary. I do think that that is necessary for people to trust in that process. I also think not only with the concerns of confidentiality, but there is a concern about, and I've heard this from other police officers, retaliation if they come forward. And now I think it's worth all of us remembering what just got passed at the State House, how this is going to marry with that. So while there may not be a disciplinary directive due to union issues, there might be a recommendation now that can come from this independent office or the Civilian Review Board. I would like to figure out which one it is to we recommend to the state to decertify, because it looks like we're going to have a certification process, right, at the state level for police officers. So how does this play? I want this ordinance to play into that process. That ultimately, I don't know if it's the commission overall, or if it's one of the independent, the Civilian Review Board, or the IOP, I know I'm mispronouncing it, makes that certification or makes that recommendation. So that's one thing I want to see in whatever gets passed. I want to also make sure that we're clear on the, I want to say, I was reading it, section, this is under investigatory powers of the ordinance, section 12-16.7, receipt, investigation, and review of complaints. Specifically, section F that talks about the limitations of the investigatory power of OPAT. And it says, no OPAT investigation shall interfere with any criminal investigation or civil proceeding by any authority with jurisdiction. Here's my concern, as I think you can see me saying this, right? We go to get someone before the Civilian Review Board and there's a civil lawsuit filed against somebody, a police officer, or so on and so forth. What I'm seeing with this language is that whatever action and accountability that could be done at this level could easily be stopped by an outside lawsuit, civil, or what, as Jerome mentioned, the DA. So I could check. I'd love to check, but I don't know why we can't have congruent investigatory powers. I don't know why. And so if we could have them at the same time, I'd like to have that, is essentially what I'm saying. I understand with the DA, there's certain investigatory or investigations where you may not want that. But by putting in civil proceedings, that's MCAD, that's a lot of whole NLRB, union. I mean, let's narrow that scope so that we can have congruent investigatory powers. I'd like to what is the exception to this rule, to our investigatory powers? I'd like that outlined in the ordinance. Does that make sense?
So on that, just background, do you mind if I comment on that real quick, just to give more background on where that came from, just so as you're digging into it. So when the task force first came out with their recommendations, Madam Chair, the mayor received a number of phone calls from DAs and other organizations who have investigative authority, and they were concerned about that interference on the local level. And so that he informed the task force, and Tanisha Sullivan and all of them thought about this. I mean, they spent a whole meeting discussing this. And I think that this language that they kind of landed on to handle that kind of protection, that there wouldn't be interference. And so that's just where it's coming from. I think we can have a conversation, but I just wanted you to know that that's where that came from.
Yes, but I don't think you understand what I'm talking about. I want just the same kind of expediency, right? So I think what I'm hoping is there's a way to narrow the scope of this so that we don't step on the toes we don't want to. But at the same time, that if you get sued an MCAD and this happens to have substantial relationship to this, I don't want that to be the reason why I don't go for the Civilian Review Board or IPAT or the commission can't subpoena you. Just so between the legal folk, I'm thinking we're in agreement. We can narrow this language.
So just, I do want to weigh in here, and I appreciate the pickup. And I just pulled up our last set of recommendations. So on the criminal piece, and Allison can weigh in here on this as well. On the criminal piece, I'm not sure that there's much leeway that we have there. And so on that one, I would probably say no, because of the criminal investigations and what's at stake in terms of liberty. With respect to civil, I absolutely think that that's a conversation, and I'm going back in my notes on this one, but would agree that is, I would say civil, unless I'm remembering this wrong. Allison. Civil is not as much of an issue as the criminal, right?
Right. Because I just recall that, you could have, when I was doing labor issues, I'd have a suit and complain at the DOL. I have a suit and complain at the AG's office, and then I have a private suit as well.
Yep.
Civil. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
But I think that's why we landed on the language of just simply saying jurisdiction, but it's where, for example, like the district attorney's office has sole jurisdiction over certain criminal acts or alleged acts, that we won't interfere with their investigation. So the others where I don't see where there would be an issue if there was an MCAD complaint or something other than that. In the civil realm, it's not as serious as it is more in the criminal realm. And that's what he sort of put that language in. If there is an issue where there's another body that has sole jurisdiction over the basis of the complaint, then you have to do you just stand back. It doesn't mean that you can't later go in and do your investigation. It just means while theirs is ongoing, we won't interfere. That's the way we looked at this.
So again, this is why we get to work in the working session, right? The language that I'd like for us to continue to work on is the limitations on investigatory power, and the one, no OPAT investigation shall interfere with any criminal investigation or civil proceeding by any authority with jurisdiction. And so the part where I think we're all narrowing in on is the civil proceeding by any authority. That I'd like to work a little bit more on. But criminal makes total sense to me.
Okay.
Always, it's the way it is, right? In general, usually the civil suits come after the criminal anyway. Okay. All right. So just want to make sure that was flagged as something I'd like to deal with. And then in terms of the nomination, so for me to be really sold on the trifecta positioning, with the overall OPAT with the two, I as a counselor need to see more of us in part of the nomination process and of those folks, including the commissioners, including the I see that we do have some in the Civilian Review Board, but on the internal affairs, we have none. So I would like to see that. And I also see the mayor has, I believe, veto power on our nominations. And so I want a better balance of power and nomination of the leadership and the roles for those what I think are very important informed positions. And so that's what I think for me to really be to be in that. We're going to open this up, but with a little bit more of our impact. So right now, the council does not, I believe, nominate any of the commissioners, the three, and we do not. Do we nominate?
Yeah. So so the commissioners, the three commissioners come from, again, that's the ED, right? So that is a hire out of the administration. The IAOP. So whoever ends up being the chair of the IAOP, and yes, currently IAOP, similar to co-op, is straight mayoral appointment. Civilian Review Board is where the hybrid comes into play. So it is possible that the council could have a voice there.
Madam Chair, I think that on behalf of the administration.
So I'm sorry, I just want to be clear. I see three commissioners, all three of them appointed by the mayor.
Correct.
Right. Well, because the chair.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that. I'm talking about those three.
Yeah.
I want the city council to be part of that conversation. I want the city council, as we already agreed, is part of the Civilian Review Board nomination conversation on both drafts. We are, but we are then not part of the former co-op, today IOP nomination process.
So what you're asking for is for the council to have a voice in who the chairs are,
the chair
or the executive director. So that's
for me. To say that this trifecta should exist, and this is something to put forward and to say to be done. I think as a counselor, I want to be part of that conversation of who is part of that leadership. And yes, we will be part of that conversation because we will, to a certain extent, have budgetary review, right? as it's going to be up in the budget. But I also want to add in, like what we do with the Boston residency job policy. We have biannual hearings set up where we have to have conversations with the Boston job, with the directive and the executive director. And those, I see that there are biannual reports pushed out summarizing the work done. But I think that I want to oversight, not even so much an oversight, but a regular check-in that is mandated within this ordinance, that the commissioners come before the city council. So this is me being direct about what I can support. I also think, just real quick, Jerome,
No worries.
I don't understand why there needs to be unanimous support for subpoena power. And why, because I do recall, one of the speakers noted that this is kind of similar to the subpoena power the council has. And that is, for me, if I want to subpoena something, I can write the letter and present it to the council, and with just a simple majority, the subpoena is issued. So if I would like that kind of autonomy to the commissioners as well. I don't want one person to be able to hold up a subpoena if two are ready to go. So I'd like that. The majority, the unanimous is I don't think that that's necessary. And then let's see. So marrying with the state new process, and so that's something that we should just all sit down and figure out, because we didn't know what the state was going to do until, what was it, today? So let's be clear. I mean, I'm not saying that that's anyone's fault. We did not know. We had hoped that would have been taken care of before we were here, but here we are. So we might want to catch up our language to refer to whatever is codified at the state level to make sure the two are talking. We want to make sure that we have, again, for me as a counselor, how that nomination process is more inclusive of us. Biannual check-ins to the council from the commissioners. Making sure that we marry the language of the, review the language of the simultaneous investigations. And just making sure also, I mean, I'm assuming that doesn't assume two simultaneous investigations within OPAT too, right? Because we just talked about how you could have both, right? Okay. And then finally, I know I wrote down one more thing. I'm so sorry. Oh, shoot. Oh man, I'm sorry, I missed my note. But those are the things that I am focused on right now until I can remember my last note. So
Council,
getting to work.
On behalf of the administration, Counselor, I think that just like the council did, I think that the administration started with the starting point on nominations, and I think that we are open to having discussions about that, about the nominations, right? And so I think that as we're in the coming days, as the council is continuing to do its work, I think the administration will be interested in having conversations with you about those specifics. Regarding subpoena, I think that we can throw that also into the conversation that you just mentioned. Regarding meetings, we had always envisioned, we left it up to the executive director because, again, as Tanisha said, at first we got really prescriptive, and then we realized that we were being too prescriptive and we pulled back. We envision that these boards are going to be meeting in the public on a regular basis, because right now, even the old co-op, new IOP, they don't meet regularly. They never meet together as a body. They just get cases and they just refer their cases back. And so we thought it was very important for the public to have that level of transparency. So we agree with you. And so to have them come before the council, I think that is just the council's oversight ability of any city department. And so I think that we would be open to having that conversation with you. Absolutely. On that. And then you caught me flat-footed on the state issue, because I just got an email a little while ago saying IGR was trying to interpret what the state did. And I do believe that we should probably seize the opportunity of tying all of our work into whatever the state is and acknowledging that work. Because I agree with you, we had that done this summer. It would have probably changed some of the task force recommendations, and it probably would have changed some of Councilor Campbell, Arroyo, and Mejia's ordinance if we actually knew what the state was doing ahead of time. And so I think let's get that interpretation and let's see what language we can get in there to tie us to the state. So I think we're open to that with you as well.
Thank you very much. I am to my counselors. I'm really over time in terms of I can probably go until 3:10, and I can check in with my vice chair, Councilor Flaherty, if he can and bring it home. But I did want to go right now we've kind of talked OPAT and had questions. I did want to go to the not so much comparison, but what are the differences between the civilian review boards, both before our body? And so just wanted to see if we could get to some of those. I just want to be clear to everyone, they're so wildly similar, by the way. I mean, there's more similar than not. And the difference is are like, how many members versus how many, it is not, we're not talking about like two different planets here. But I did want to make sure that if people had concerns or had specifics about that, Councillor Bach already talked about, the ordinance and the way in which it was filed, but specifically getting down into the ordinance, the powers, the difference. Other big difference is there is an office referred to for the Civilian Review Board in Councillor Campbell's ordinance, versus it looks like the administration creates an overarching office and structure bigger than that, of which the Civilian Review Board is part of. So if you want, for my colleagues, just to make it easier, I would suggest you look at the comparison chart. There's two between, the administration has one as well as Councillor Campbell. And I'd like to direct, in the time that I have left, Councillor Campbell, Mejia, and Arroyo. I saw your face, Councillor Mejia, sorry. All three have. In that, if you could look at the comparison charts, so we can get into now the CRB, Civilian Review Board comparisons. What we can, Is everyone there? And I'll go back in line until I can't anymore. And then I'll have to turn over and see. So Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This has been a really helpful discussion for me to get my head around the different moving parts to this. I'm very, very excited that we are getting close to the finishing line on this. I like the idea of the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency as being the umbrella organizing unit to cover internal affairs and civilian review boards. So I really don't have any questions. The question about the budget was an important one for me, and also just in terms of taking in request for an investigation. Is there will the review board be taking anonymous requests, or will folks have to disclose their identity if they have an issue that they're very concerned about?
Great question.
So I think initially it's similar to the way it is now. There can be anonymous. Right now, you can make anonymous tips into the police department, and we would assume that you would be able to make those same anonymous tips into the body, this new body, to do an investigation. There are going to be situations where, especially if it moves into a criminal proceeding, that you are going to have to identify yourself, counselor. So I think that is where I think that as the executive director comes in and starts formulating the rules and regulations of the work that they're going to do, that the council should hold a hearing and talk to the executive director about their thoughts and the directions that they're going to go to snag those issues, right? Because there's issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and things like that you might want to not have so outward in the public. And that also came up when the task force was discussing how we're going to put the data, right? Because a lot of this department is going to do is post a lot of data onto websites for individuals to click on. You're going to be able to click on and see where cases are, see what's in cases. But then we flag, well, if you clicking on the cases, are you identifying who the accusers are? And instead of identifying information. So there's a lot of work left to do once we decide the framework. And I think that the council is going to be extremely engaged as executive director kind of builds out the system. And so I think that those are some questions that when we do actually have someone in place to staff whatever it is that we come up with, the council should bring that person in and have that discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor, is that okay, Councillor Braden? Are you all set?
I'm all set, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bach?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions, and a few of these, sorry, are related to the OPAT at large, but it's where the place it's being inserted in the municipal code It's chapter 11, right, which is public services, which is where we have police, fire, a bunch of things. And then it says 11.2-16. When I'm looking at that, it's putting us into sort of security systems, so I must be in the wrong place. But can you guys discuss about the location in the code? And really what I'm thinking of is, there's a question of size of budget and leaving that to a conversation with the ED, Jerome, but there's also a question of whose budget. Like, we're talking about an independent office. Is this within the police department budget? Is this within an independent office's own budget? And if so, where in cabinet is it going? And who is the chief overseeing it? I mean, what's the kind of place in the city structure that you guys are envisioning?
So we had a lot of conversations around that about where it would be housed, and we are trying to make it as independent as possible by not staffing it underneath a cabinet and having it currently directed off of the mayor's office. The task force was very adamant that this have no correlation to the Boston Police Department, have no reliance on Boston Police Department funding or budgeting. It will be solely separate commission, separately funded, without any connection to the Boston Police Department. So that is the current iteration, is that it is technically going to be, because we're not housing it, there's conversations about putting it under my cabinet, putting it under Carolyn Crockett's cabinet. And at the end, what was decided is that we would put it off as a freestanding commission that has the dotted line to the mayor's office. And I'm sorry, I'll have to get you the answer back about the code.
Yeah, it's just confusing because the version I'm looking at online, you don't get to 11-2-16. So there must be, I must be looking at something wrong, or.
Yeah, because I'm looking at 12-16 point, but maybe I'm looking at the wrong one. I can get you, we'll get you an answer to that question, Councilor.
Okay, yeah, if you could just exactly where it's going in the code and sort of how that decision was reached would be great. And then to Councilor Edwards's point about the CRB, I understand that, like, looking at this, it looks like your three commissioners over OPAT are sort of constituted by, one's the executive director, and then the other two are the chairs of these boards, right? So those two commissioners, they're not being nominated as commissioners of OPAT, they're being nominated as chairs of the two boards. Is that right? And then they become commissioners of OPAT by virtue of that?
Right.
So, but I do think that, so in that sense, I think the council role does end up being around how those two boards are appointed. And what Councilor Janey referred to, right, I think it's very confusing for us to have that language all be codified in an executive order. I think that's another reason to move it into ordinance. And I'll also just say that I think my concern about the ordinance as it stands right now is that it makes a lot of reference to executive orders. There's extensive use of the IOP and the CRB terms, which are then defined by the executive order issuance date. But of course, if the executive order went away, we would have a weird dead letter law on our hand, right? It would be referencing something that doesn't have standing. So I just really want to stress that, to me, this it's not an academic point in terms of just giving this thing as firm of a basis as it can be. And I think it would be great from a trading language perspective if the administration could spin up its executive orders into ordinance form, so that we could be having that in the sort of conversation with 0885. Because I think that's been causing some of it's a little hard to go back and forth on language without that piece. So, and then I just would, and in terms of appointing on the CRB, I do think we need more clarity both on how the council would come to its nominations, and also because I think there is a difference between investing nominations personally in the person of the city council president versus the body. Like, I think it's not clear that there would be a body process there. And then the language, I think specifically in the executive order, says that the council can kind of nominate people, but the mayor doesn't have to take any of the people who the council nominates, and then can keep asking the council for new nominees. And that seems, I think, suboptimal to me as a counselor. So I think that's part of why we have to have this on the table. But I heard you already, Jerome, say we can have that conversation. So I think just wanted to add my kind of +1 to those concerns. Also to Councilor Edwards flagged most of the other issues I had at the language. The subpoena unanimity, I think, really raises the possibility of one person who never wants to issue a subpoena. And I think that could really hurt the board. And I think, there's an overbroad civil exception there in terms of keeping the board from doing its work. I also worry about whether civil proceedings related to labor disputes could end up getting read as a reason why the board can't look into anything. And I think that's another major concern. As folks know from yesterday, I'm very concerned about the ways in which the contract constrains the effectiveness of any civilian review board because of what you referenced about the fact that fundamentally this civilian review board is making a recommendation to the police commissioner, and then the police commissioner is going to make an action. It's not even a question of the police commissioner might not listen to the CRB, although he might not, but it's that then the police commissioner might make a determination and it might be overturned based on our contract. And I think that happens too often. So that's another separate conversation, but I just wanted to flag that because of that concern, I think it's doubly important that we not allow a loophole. And even if it were a loophole that basically just created the opportunity for people to constantly challenge the board's jurisdiction, even if we are then going to defeat those challenges, that's not the right kind of civil thing, or it's not, like, it could just be a real distraction and a delay tactic. So definitely second Councilor Edwards on that. Yeah, and then I think on the budget stuff, it's really, to me, part of establishing an office in law by the council in partnership with the administration should be about saying where that office sits. And so it's fine if where that office sits is, like, I'm very open to the conversation about being an independent commission. That's not, certainly I don't think it makes sense to have it within the department, within the police department. And I'm fairly agnostic about which cabinet it sits under, but I do think that that's the type of thing that we should be stating when we're codifying it. So those are some comments from me, and I think I won't kind of issue questions further because I think the subpoena power and the appointments and the civil suit language is all stuff that we're going to go back and forth on. But I just would really urge the administration to spin up the executive orders into language that can be directly compared from an ordinance perspective on the CRB and IOP side. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you
Madam
so
Chair,
much.
if you may, 30 seconds. I just wanted to respond to Councilor Bach. I think that I've heard loud and clear now from the chair and from yourself. And if it is the chair's desire for the administration to come back with some form of document in ordinance form as a way of trading language, I'll bring that back as a request from the council. Again, I understand you guys have a process and you have multiple things that you're doing, but if that is the desire of the chair and the council for us to present you with something to chew on that way, I will bring that back. I've heard loud and clear, I think, from all of you today that is something that you desire. So there are some of my colleagues who are watching this right now, and so I think that we will huddle back if that is the case. And so we'll wait.
The most sense, just to quickly, since it does make the most sense, as Councilor Bach noted, the ordinance before us refers to executive orders. It would be so much easier if it referred to ordinances. That way we were dealing with the same conversation, the same process, and the same legal authority all in one.
And I want to say, just to tag on that, to me it is really important the work that the task force has put into this process, and the fact that there have been a lot of conversation and consultations about how certain things should be. And so I would part of my sort of deference to and respect for that process is that I would like to be looking at language that represents the task force's recommendations, right? Which is what you have in the executive orders, so that I can be starting from the question of what is my argument as a counselor for changing this, right? As opposed to kind of starting from the question of does the task force need to relitigate for us every conversation that it had internally? Because I actually do think that a number of people on the task force have put a ton of time, not just on the task force, but in their entire careers into thinking about this. And I don't presume to be as expert as they are. And also, I think there was a real consultative process, but it's frustrating to not have that before us formally, as we're having this conversation. So that's now I'm really done. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Counselor, I think Counselor Flynn he did have a conflict. Counselor Asabi George might also have had to go. I'm just going through then, I guess, for Counselor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief. I think a lot of folks covered many of the questions I had specifically around the budget and other specifics. But what's clear is we can clearly work out the differences to actually get to a place where we're establishing or passing, I should say, an ordinance to set this up. Appreciate all of the task force members who participated today, Jamal, Tanisha, Allison, I saw on here as well. And of course, the administration, Jerome, and many others for the hearing today, for the working session. I have nothing else to add, only that I look forward to some of the suggested changes coming back to us in some type of ordinance form that we can finalize all the details. And then the last thing I will say is I also appreciated the response to why a civilian review board and the carving out of another board to address the internal affairs cases. Tanisha brought up some of that thought process there. Appreciated that level of detail, so thank you. I'm not locked into that, if anything. I just had concerns around if we do keep that model, how do we have that balance of power? How do we allow the council to have more input there to create more of a checks and balance, which is, I think, what your line of questioning got to. And so I appreciated the responses to that too. So looking forward to finalizing the language. And of course, thank you to my council colleagues as well for their feedback and input too. So thank you, Madam Chair. Looking forward to finalizing this.
Wonderful, wonderful. Councilor Mejia.
Yes. So I have to say, Councilor Edwards, Madam Chair, I think that our entire public should be incredibly grateful to you and how easy you are able to make, until you started speaking, I'm like, okay. You just do such a great job at helping people understand the nuts and bolts of what it is that we're discussing. So I really do appreciate some of the points that you brought into the conversation, and I echo those concerns. Specifically, I don't want this to be another appointed school board situation where we're always fighting because we don't have a voice. So I don't think having the mayor appoint all the powers that be will sit well with me. So I am going to second and third all of those recommendations to making sure that we have a formal voice and choice in terms of who sits in any of these spaces. So thank you so much for elevating that because we already know what we're dealing with the school board situation. The other piece that I want to just kind of reiterate here is that I think, we didn't really dive deep into this, but, the way the ordinance that we have filed reads, we don't have police officers on the board. And what I worry about is because there already is a lot of distrust within the system, that we're going to have to really iron out that piece of the conversation. Just something to just flag as something that we need to kind of figure out. And I'd love to be able to recommend whichever ordinance or however this gets filed, is that I'd like to see accountability at a dashboard. I do know that we're going to be meeting on a regular basis, but I just think that it's important in terms of the transparency piece, for us to have information in real time. In terms of the status from the moment something gets filed to when something gets resolved. I'd like to be able to see some sort of tracking of put in place for accountability in that space. And then I'm going to end with my little youth on board situation. I really do think it's important for us to continue to drum that beat on how important it is to have young people reflected and participating in that process. So I just want to, that will be a deal breaker for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate where the tone of this has gone to what we really want in this. So I thank everyone so far and for being here. Counselor Janey, I don't know if she, yep, Counselor Janey.
Thank you so much. And as you can see, I'm rejoining. I had to step away for 2 o'clock. So I've missed the last hour. It sounds like I'm stepping into a conversation where things are in a good place. So I look forward to catching up on what I've missed and participating in next steps. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Counselor Janey. Counselor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to echo a lot of what we've already heard, right? I think for me, overriding everything has been how this operates internally, the board itself, right? And for me, the Civilian Review Board that was put forward by myself and Councilor Campbell and Councilor Mejia was just one board with one ED, with one staff, and that's much more streamlined almost by definition because it's 1-1-1. When you create the two separate boards going directly to one executive board, that's not necessarily bad or worse. It just has questions about how they interact within that ecosystem that you've created. And I know we've seen, you know, Jerome knows this too, working with City Hall. There's a lot of ways in which creating just even one extra thing can make another team's effectiveness really hard. And so for me, it's more so trying to preemptively, as much as possible, if we do end up adopting this two-board system, ensuring that we're not giving them barriers to being successful or accountable or able to do their work, and that we're sort of preemptively seeing where there might be blind spots, where there might be problems, so that we can create as much prescriptive information in here so that whoever that executive director is isn't winging it. We don't have issues with, you know, one board is investigating something, the other board should be privy to it or would like to have that information, but they're not because the two boards don't communicate. And then you have an executive director stuck in between the two of them, making decisions about what to share and what not to share with no real oversight from any other body as to what decisions that executive director is allowed to make one way or the other. And I think a lot of the answers that I've gotten for these questions, I deeply appreciate. I know that I've had conversations both here and off of this with task force members about the decision to get to two instead of one. And I think there was a lot of nuance and thought. Nobody did it just to do it. And I think the question is making sure that we work together effectively, that whether or not it's one, whether or not it's two, the result that we're all seeking is accountability, the ability to have real power and teeth as far as that's allowed. And that's really what I think unites this. I think we're much closer than we are apart. I think the one major difference is the two board as opposed to the one streamlined one. And I can go either way on that. If I'm being perfectly honest, either way works for me, provided we answer a lot of these little nitty gritty questions about workload, how do we do communication within those groups? And so I'm happy with the way in which this has gone. I know, Jerome, you're going to get some more information on that. I think separate and apart, I would just echo what everybody else has echoed on appointments. That's separate and apart to the functionality of the board. Now we're talking about who makes up these boards. But, you know, I think from the functionality standpoint, we're so close to just making this work that I just would love to dive into those little things, because once those get cleared up for me, I don't really have an issue with the makeup of the board, right? We get to that second part, that's fine. We can fight over appointments and we can do all the stuff we have to do to make sure that the board's populated by the right kind of folks. But for me, my major thing is I don't want to put something into ordinance, into creation, and then have all these flaws with how they work administratively within each other, because that's going to take forever to iron out, fix, and we may never have the opportunity to iron that out once it gets created. And so that's just where I'm at on it. I appreciate everybody coming here with the attitude of being willing to work and being willing to kind of look past, you know, who's getting credit for what's, you know, why am I married to an idea? I like that folks are able to talk right now about just effectiveness as opposed to, you know, this was something that I came up with, so it's really important to me that we keep it. More so, this is why I think it's important. And that's really where I want the conversation to stay. So I appreciate that. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Madam Chair, for chairing this. I think you've done an excellent job.
Thank you. Excuse me, Councilor Flaherty. You may have had to jump. Very well, that just leaves me, and I'm going to go ahead and say thank you for participating to all. I'm committed to getting something done if y'all are. I'm committed to putting the work in if y'all are. And I'm happy to, and I'm to the point that, like, because of our limited time, I'm happy to meet you Friday, 8 a.m. and put the work in working sessions and do this so that we go, if we have to go paragraph by paragraph and the OPAT. And then if you guys have those draft up or marked up ordinance, like not perfect, you know, kind of things. And so we can do the markup so that we are really headed towards a finality of this moment and recognize it for what it is, a historic moment and coming together of a historic task force of leaders, Black and Brown, law enforcement, historic city council, majority women, majority people of color, and this sense of urgency and meeting the moment. I think we should see it in that positive light. And thank you, the sponsors, Councilor Janey, Councilor Mejia, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Mejia, Councilor Arroyo, for your doing this. Thank you, the task force. Thank you, Jerome. I think you're gonna end your career here on a high note.
But if you will let me just 10 seconds.
You got it.
I just want to thank you, Madam Chair. This was actually a good conversation.
Oh, sorry, I missed this.
I will admit, as I did to you yesterday, probably should have happened earlier. As far as a timeline, just gonna let you all know that I love you each dearly, but Friday is my last day as a public servant, and I am going to work as hard as I can with each and every one of you until Friday, and then the administration will present you another individual should this go past Friday. But I thought today was a very good conversation. I've been in depth in this work for a short amount of time with task force members all summer. And sometimes I see that the work just needs to get done. But I also see that you guys also see the work gets done. So I think this was a great conversation. And I do appreciate the thoughtfulness of the questions. And we are getting you the information that you requested. And I just texted a couple of the law department folks to kind of start drafting something for you, Madam Chair, to share with your members. But again, I just wanted to thank you guys all. And also I want to take a personal liberty. I know the council's getting mad at me, but I want to thank each of you. It was fun to work with you guys for the past 6.5 years. I've been a public servant for 20 years. I was a council staffer when Mike Ross was the councilor. I was his chief of staff. So I know how hard it is to be a city councilor, to fight for your residents and to always be at it. And so on a personal note, separate administration as Jerome Smith, I just want to thank you guys all. You guys have all treated me with respect, and I've really enjoyed my time here. And now I get to call all your offices if I live in your neighborhoods, asking for things to pick up on my street. And so I will be calling you as a constituent. But I look forward to working with you.
Don't come to East Boston. District 1 is off limits. Just saying.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. With that, we're going to close this out. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.